So there's a common principle in people's notion of what good thinking is, which goes something like, if I say X and you say not X, or vice versa, or whatever, or one of us thinks one of those and the other thinks not that, then at least one of us must be wrong. Who here sort of feels like, yeah, that seems basically right? In other words, if our views disagree, we can't both be correct. And I would say that most people understand this somewhat, sort of out in the world. And I would say rationalists understand this way better than most people do. That there's a really key principle about understanding that we can't just sort of sit around with different opinions and sort of be like, well, I know what's going on. No, I know what's going on. They're like, someone's got to be confused. And I want to do a little experiment. I'd like you to look at me. I'm going to stand where everybody can see me. Okay, those people move. So I'd like you to look at me and take one of your fingers and put it on kind of the bridge of your nose. And then move it a few inches towards me. You want to turn your head to face me if you're not already. Okay. Now, while you're looking at me and you have your finger there, which side of me is your finger on? Right. So if you close your left eye, now your finger's on the left side of me, right? If you close your right eye, your finger's on the right side. Okay, so I have a $1 million question for you. Which of those views is correct? Which of them is wrong?
What do you mean by correct?
There's a thing that your brain could be doing, which is arguing between these two views. No, it's on the left. No, it's on the right. No, it's... Your eyes are constantly showing you two slightly different things. And your brain does not, most of the time, engage in an argument between the two of them, as a sort of like, which of these is correct? That would be a huge waste of time. It does not, as you guys noted, there's a neither quality to that. And what your brain does is it deals with that both neither quality and somehow comes up with not this view or that view, but some new, deeper view. The world occurs to us in 3 dimensions in large part because of this difference. Not because we figure out which of the eyes is correct, but because we see something that we couldn't see if we had only one of those eyes. And this is something that we are not actually, as far as I know, born knowing how to do. We are born knowing how to learn how to do it. But for infants, their eyes have a lot of trouble actually creating a shared sense of a shared depth sense of the world. And you can watch them kind of practice this skill by just staring at something intently. Like, And what they're doing there is they're dealing with the discomfort of these two views that seem to sort of be saying the same thing, and yet they're saying something slightly different. And after a while of practicing that, they develop this sense of, oh, there's just one world here. There's not 2 different worlds, and I need to somehow figure out which of them I'm in. I'm in both of them, somehow. And therefore, it's just one world that I'm in at the same time, that I'm seeing from different perspectives. So, we also do this with our other senses as kids. So it's like the forming of the common sense, which is to say the shared gestalt of the world that occurs to us via the combination of our sight and our sound and our touch other senses, of which there are definitely more than 5. That's a psyop, don't believe that. It's not clear to me how many there are, but we have a sense for how much potassium we have in our bloodstream. That's a sense. It's a sense organ that we have, right? And then we also have, thermoception, which is not the canonical 5. Anyway, that's an aside.
Like the sense, scientifically.
Right.
Like, you said we don't have 5 senses, but like we have that we can express, but then we self-express other things. When you say sense, what do you mean?
What do I mean by sense? Ooh, that's a good question.
Start with definitions.
Right?
Start with definitions.
Start with definitions. Yeah. So this is an interesting thing. So, one of the ways that we try to deal with these issues is by operationalizing things, coming up with definitions and trying to pin down the semantics of a lot of this stuff. I'm not exactly totally sure what I mean by sense. But I know what I mean by it. I have a felt sense, if you will, of what I mean by it. And of course, when we're actually going about learning language as we grow up, similar to the ways that we learn how to see, we don't actually do most of that through definitions either. We somehow get a shared sense of what we mean by a lot of things, not just through definitions. And I think there's something interesting and important and relevant about that, how we can, in a similar way to how we combine this view and that view, it's like we somehow combine every way we've heard people use a word into some 3D gestalt of that word. That's pretty neat. I think that's really actually very cool. And I think it says something important about the amount of incredible work that our minds are already doing at a level before we even sort of, try to take over and do it intentionally and deliberately. Having said all of that, I will say a bit more about what I mean by sense, which is something like, a way of knowing. So, each of my eyes is sort of a sense, but we could also divide it up into, well, I've got rods and cones, and I've got different kinds of cones, and so there are various perceptual cells that I have that are designed to perceive certain types of things. Design there is a bit of an interesting word, but they're made for that. There's so many tangents that I'm working very hard to not go into. Although I like tangents a lot. But yeah, you can ask me later if you want to talk about how teleology and evolution can be friends. But that's not the center of what I want to point out right now. So a sense is sort of these ways of knowing, and so they include down to the rawest sense cells, photoreceptors and so forth. But also, I feel like we have a gestalt sense, and as humans in particular, with our increased, our vast neuroplasticity and mimetic vibes, it seems clear to me that we can develop new senses. So, as a great example, who here has a sense of whether there's something you've copied to your clipboard that you haven't pasted yet? Right, so that's a sense in the way that I'm using it. That is a sense that you have. There is a sense of something important on my clipboard. Don't lose it. By the way, did you know clipboard managers exist? You can get a thing where your clipboard just creates a giant list of everything you copy to it. It's amazing. It's life-changing. I don't know why operating systems don't come with it built in. Anyway, okay, so we have senses, and these senses report different things, and in some ways, the different things seem like they contradict at times, and yet somehow it sure seems like they're all sensing the same universe from some perspective in some way. And so somehow, everything that we are sensing must be compatible somehow. Now, it might be that I'm looking out of my eyes and I'm like, geez, okay, one eye is telling me that there's a big, strange, hairy blob of a vine that's covering the whole room. And the other eye is saying, nah, like there's a bunch of people or whatever. And I'm like, which of these is true? What's happened there is, both eyes are still reporting sort of entirely accurately, but if I say what I just did, I've made a poor generalization of what's going on with this eye that I have covered with my own hair. It's like, I'm like, oh, all that hair is filling the room. It's like, well, it's filling the field of view in this eye. We don't actually make that mistake with things that are so obvious, but we do make that mistake with things that are less obvious. In the realms of therapy and things like circling, we talk about projection, where you perceive in the world a lot of dynamics that are suspiciously like the dynamic you had with your mom. It's like, most people are not seeing my mom everywhere, I hope. Like, what's going on there? Well, we have a refined sense for these dynamics that happened, and that sense is activating and trying to protect us or whatever's going on with that. And on that note, actually, this is a really good way to highlight this. So, there's something called Capgras delusion, which is when somebody is convinced that a person or people close to them have been replaced with imposters. It's a very weird thing that happens. One of the ways that it can happen is that the fusiform gyrus, which recognizes faces, gets somehow severed from the emotional system of the brain. There's some sort of stroke or lesion or whatever that causes that. And as a result, the person sees, let's say their husband or their mom or someone who they would expect to feel warmth when they see them, and they don't feel that warmth. And they conclude, this can't be the person that it is supposed to be, because if it were, I would feel that warmth. And so what's going on there? So the person is having some perception, and they're having this sense of, I don't feel the way I should feel if this person is actually who they say they are, who they even agree they look like, my girlfriend. But they're turning that sort of negative sense, they're turning an absence of a sense of assurance that somebody is someone into a positive claim that the person is not. You must be an imposter. There's a shift that happens there from, I can't trust that you are this person, to you must not be this person. And that makes it really hard to sync up. It's very uncomfortable, I imagine, to be in a close relationship with somebody who has this going on. I would be very curious to see if I could do useful work with some of my frameworks with someone who has Capgras delusion. If you know any of that, I don't know. So, where was I going with that? Senses, generalization. Does anybody else know where I was going with that? Pardon? Oh, right. This was it was an example of a way that people do make this error. Like, one of their senses is sort of producing something that sort of jars with the other senses, and it causes them to make a really weird generalization from that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So, a few more images to highlight some of this. This first chunk of the talk is inspired in part by Unflattening by Nick Sousanis, which is a PhD thesis that looks like this. Coolest PhD thesis ever. And it's an entire book of sort of illustrated perspective. And it highlights exactly the exercise that I led you guys through at the very start. Yeah, so I just wanted to share that image, I think, basically. And okay, so here's another way of looking at this. This image, I think, comes from Daniel Schmachtenberger, or at least he has a blog post that talks about this. And he highlights that, if we're having a disagreement about what's going on, and we're both looking at the world, and we're like, what is this thing? And I'm like, geez, it sure looks like a square. And you're like, it's definitely a circle. I don't know what you're talking about, man. It's for real a circle, right? Because you're looking from the left, and I'm looking from the right. And one thing we could do is we could just sort of be like, I don't know, man, you're wrong. That doesn't get us very far. Another thing we could do is kind of, we could kind of try to compromise and come up with some sort of squircle, or like a rounded rectangle, or like a, I don't know, like a thing that's like a circle on the top, and but all of these are clearly unsatisfying, because it's not that it's those things. It's a circle and a square. It is specifically those, and not some halfway in between thing, but it is specifically those from different perspectives. And I think in practice, a lot of what we do when we do disagreements, in practice, a lot of what that ends up doing is taking each other's perspective. We highlight experiences that we've had that the other person hasn't had, and try to use those as part of helping them see what we're seeing. We basically say, wow, I'm seeing this, like, I don't see this. Well, come stand over here. Come stand over here and look from where I'm looking. And then you've also got to make sure you're looking in the same place, right? Because if I'm looking at, this, I'm like, it's a circle, and you're looking at this and being like, it's a square. It's like, well, that's a different problem. So we have to make sure we're looking at the same thing too. So one of the reasons I wanted to include this image is that we're looking at 2D projections here, right? But this shape in the middle is 3D, right? It's also a 2D projection. That's interesting, but it's a better 2D projection, right? Like, it's one that actually highlights its 3D-ness. It lets you see both sides. It lets you unproject it in a way that the yellow and blue things don't. Exactly. So that's why I wanted to include this one. And it is still less than, in a sense, the actual full 3D view. Okay, so earlier I showed you this, and you guys agreed with me. I don't actually believe this. I think that this is confused. I think it's important. There's something important about it, but I think it's actually confused. And what I would say if we replace it with is, if you say X and I say not X, or you think X and I think not X, we're each seeing something the other isn't. It's not that one of us is wrong or both of us are wrong. It's that there's some way in which our perspectives don't include each other. And it may be that one of us is seeing sort of the full picture and the other's only seeing part of the picture. Usually it's not that. With anything complex, it's usually not that. There's usually something that the person who's seeing sort of the smaller picture is seeing that the person who's seeing the bigger one is not, as far as I can tell from looking into this a bunch. But yeah, is there a question at the back?
Yes, so I think that, like in the case of the square and rectangle, both views are not wrong, because views are just like pure experience of what they see. So if they see a rectangle, they probably just see a rectangle, but if they conclude from that the figure in front of them is a rectangle, then the conclusion is wrong. But the experience is not wrong. So in that case, both conclusions would be wrong, but the experience of seeing a rectangle would not be.
Yeah. This is. I think I see what you're getting at here, and it's very relevant. So thank you. Part of what we're trying to figure out is, and I think one of the things that sort of gets taken a bit for granted when we're trying to do epistemology. What is the sort of thing that can be true? There are statements about the world. There are something we might call propositions. And the propositions are the thing that's often considered as the sort of thing that can be true. This is kind of what a lot of philosophers do. They're like, yes, propositions can be true. And here's how the laws of truth work with propositions, and we can do logic on them. And then to your point, what that creates is a framework within which we can say things are true. It's like one type of framework within which we can say things are true is a convention about what 1 and plus and 2 and equals mean. And that lets us be sort of like, well, yeah, okay, 1 plus 1 equals 2 is a statement that has truth to it. But even there, we do still have to know what we mean. 1 cup of water and 1 cup of salt put together do not make 2 cups of anything. They make something like 1 cup of salt water, probably plus a bit of salt that wasn't able to dissolve. And So there's still some way in which we need to somehow map the, there's a deep, deep truth to 1 + 1 = 2. There's something really, really deep there and unassailable, unalienable. Like you know that 1 + 1 = 2 insofar as that applies to whatever it is that you're thinking about. But then there's the question of like, how do you apply it? So we have these propositions, we have these statements, we have these word utterances, and yet somehow the truthiness of them, the truthfulness of them, still depends on some sort of frame or interpretation or being able to map them onto something like what we mean by the proposition or what that proposition would imply about our experience. And so, in a way, it seems to me like where the truth sort of comes back to is a bit connected with our senses in some way. And I'm still, a lot of this is on the edge of my own thinking. Like, I've been staring at this a lot, but I don't have it all figured out. I'm not presenting to you an all figured outness. I'm presenting to you a way of looking at this whole thing that for me has shone a lot of light and that has been helpful for other people I've talked to. So there's something about perspectives being something like true or something. But then this is very weird because in a sense they're all true, like the perspective that I have that I have some bunch of hair floating in the room, filling up the room is my eye is being truthful here. But then I'm doing some sort of generalization that's untrue. And so I've been looking about it like, how do people go about making generalizations? And a couple years ago, I realized that everybody is constantly overgeneralizing. A few moments ago, I realized maybe that's just me. But it seems like there is a kind of overgeneralizing process that goes on because necessarily we're trying to explain everything, and we only know something. Okay, come.
We need more data.
We need more data, yeah, but we need sort of I think we always need more data. Like we always don't have all of the data, and we're always trying to form a sense of everything. And so we're kind of filling in the picture. We are stretching our experience thin to wrap it to cover everything. And that's what generalization is. We can't get away from the fact that we need to do that, as far as I can tell. Like that's just an inherent part of how the knowing process works. But there are situations where we get into some weird hole with the overgeneralizations, like the person who's projecting, stuff from their ex onto everybody, or their abusive boss, or their, whatever. Okay, what is the next slide? Oh yeah, that's very relevant to what I'm talking about. It's almost like I made the slide myself. For this very talk. So people have perspectives, and those perspectives, I would say, include, and I'm not attached to how we use any of the words here, to be very clear. But for the purpose of what I'm saying, people have perspectives, and these perspectives include not just senses, but generalizations. That might literally contradict the way that I used the word sense earlier, I'm not sure. We sometimes talk about senses as being kind of like external, but it's not quite that simple because, first of all, defining in and out is way harder than you might think it is, as most Buddhists will point out. And also, we have introspective senses, like we can look at our own mind, whatever that means. But there's a way the world seems to us, and part of that seemingness is, let's say, sensorial, which is to say, it seems to us that we are in a room right now. Like that is a thing that we are all having a seemingness of, unless you're that guy walking outside with his baby, or unless you're watching this at home and you're inside or whatever. It does not always seem to everybody that they're in a room, but like it seems to those of us who are in this room that we're in this room, and that's just a part of our sense of what is so. And when
How do you face gender here?
how how do I place gender here? What is was there a rest of your question?
It was like you said that you tend to generalize your perspectives, but here most of what I see are male, and I recognize as woman, but I recognize also as non-binary. So if I generalize, would you generalize as a man, as a human, or as a non-binary? What's your perspective first? We cannot generalize because we don't know if we don't ask, or if you don't tell.
Yeah. I think I can probably come back to that at some point. Yeah.
I was just going to request something. Maybe we can please leave questions for the end because it's impossible to follow the thread.
Yeah. My thinking is branchy enough on its own. It really is. I got that high branch factor. Okay. Cool. So yeah. So there's a way the world seems to each of us. And sometimes there's a way the world seems to all of us. Like we can have a sort of collective sense of we're in a room or whatever. And sometimes we collectively do not have a shared sense of things. And one of the useful things that we already use for this, but I decided to give it a name, is co-epistemic status tags. So this is basically tagging whatever it is that you're saying with some sort of phrase that indicates partially your degree of confidence in what you're saying, but also you're indicating the degree of confidence or resonance or agreement or shared senseness that you expect the other person to have. And it seems to me that people do this a lot in general. Like we already have phrases for this that we use. And as far as I can tell, one of the things that happens for people is that when you use the wrong one, things are like weird and awkward. So if I were like, obviously, Jesus is the Son of God and he came down to solve all of our sins or whatever, in some rooms, people would be like, yeah, obviously. And it would actually be weird if I said, as far as I can tell. But as you know, in this room, it would be kind of weird if I said that with the obviously in front of it. And in this situation, it wasn't because I said the whole thing in quotation marks. Like I didn't actually utter it as a speech act. I said, if I said, then I put the whole thing in quotation marks. And we track that. We track all of that quite naturally, actually. And there's also, of course is another one, by the way, of course. There's also, of course, an untagged statement. So that's where I don't say obviously or as you know or whatever. I simply say, we're in Berlin. And that statement, to some degrees, it depends on the situation, but sometimes I think the untagged ones are even more extremely in the direction of the obviously and as you know than the obviously and as you know. Because they're simply stating something as true, as we should all agree that. But they don't even say that. They leave it in presupposition mode. So it's like the famous question, is the King of France bald? It looks like a yes or no question, but the only truthful way to answer that question is, what? Because France does not have a king. And so the question has presupposed something. Now, so there's something kind of similar there. People do a lot of this presupposition, and when you get into stuff about frame dialogue or frame battles or frame control or anything like that, a lot of that happens in the realm of things getting weirdly tagged in such a way that sort of gets people to buy in with them when actually something feels off. So I try to be really clear with a lot of this stuff, and that's one of the things that you can practice, is being more clear. When am I speaking for how things seem to me, and I don't actually know how they seem to you, or I actually have a sense of how they seem to you, and I know that it's different from mine, but I'm going to speak for how things seem to me. And when am I actually attempting to speak for what I think we all share, what we all see in common, and so forth. I didn't plan what I was going to say for this slide. I guess I figured it would be obvious. Yeah, different things are obvious to different people. That sentence that I just said is obvious, right? And yet, I think we sometimes forget that that's true. Like, obviously, different things are obvious to different ones of us. And yet, somehow, this thing that is obvious when pointed out, we often go around being surprised by the need to say the obvious. And one of the heuristics that I found that has borne me a lot of fruit, it's a very cheap heuristic, it's say the obvious. And there's an even more specific thing here, which is if it feels like something should go without saying, like if it feels to you like something should go without saying, like it's so obvious, like how could that even be a question? And yet, somebody else seems to be sort of demanding that you say it. Say it. No, seriously, like I had a thing with my ex at one point where we were together at the time. But we were in a whole complex situation that I won't go into the details of, but she was talking about how she was stressed and how she didn't know people in the place that we were living at that time. And I got this weird sense that she thought that I wanted her to not have friends. Like that felt like the tone of what she was saying. And I was like, what the fuck? How could you possibly think that I would want that? I'm your partner. I want you to have friends. I want you to be connected. And I had all these reasons and justifications of like why I had done all the things that I'd done that sort of seemed to her like the things that I was doing because I didn't want her to have friends or wanted her not to have friends, which is even more extreme. And I was just like flabbergasted and frankly very offended. And what I mean by that is I was upset that she could be perceiving me in such a way that it was not obvious that I wanted her to have friends. I was upset to be experiencing myself. Like if I tried to take her perspective, the me that I saw was horrendous. I was like, ew, I'm not that guy. So I kind of tried arguing about all of that. Instead, what I said was, so I have a new heuristic that I've been working with called saying the obvious. And so I'm gonna say something that this is a co-epistemic status tag, by the way, a particularly weird one. So I said I'm gonna say something that should go without saying. I mean that's another phrase. Like I've been trying to say things that should go without saying. And then I looked at her and I said, I want you to have friends. And she started crying. Because she could tell that I meant it. And just that phrase connected with the part of her that was implicitly feeling that I didn't. It made contact with that. It didn't deny that that was what she was experiencing. But it made contact with it and said, no, I do want you to have friends. And that might not have worked. Like, it might have been that she would have still not trusted me at that point. Like, there's no guarantee that any given thing that one says will land. But it's shocking the extent to which just acknowledging these things that have somehow come into doubt, even though from your perspective, it's like, how could that be doubted? Do you even know me? Well, I mean, most of the other person might know you. But earlier when I said people have perspectives, we have many perspectives, each of us. It's not just one or two. And so from an IFS perspective, like internal family systems, like parts work, that kind of thing, people have parts. We are vast, we contain multitudes, and a person might know you very well, but you might be relating with a part of them that basically has never met you. And that's part of what you're dealing with when you're relating with people. So coming back to the thing around parallax and what's technically called stereopsis, which is where you get the 3D view out of the two eyes. So your eyes do this depth perception thing where they take the differences and synthesize them into some wham, wholeness that appears. And it seems to me that when we're thinking clearly and effectively about the world, including all of our generalizations about it, we are also doing that kind of synthesis. And sometimes even techniques that are setting out with the question of like, which view is correct, end up doing this synthesis anyway. Like, double crux is sort of ambiguous on this front about what it's trying to do. Like, it definitely has a lot of phrases like, well, what would cause you to change your mind? And what would cause you to change your mind? Like, one way to think about this is like, literally, like, the two perspectives, like, one's over here, and the other's over here, and you're sort of trying to figure out, like, can you get this person to walk over there and see what the world looks like from that point of view? And then, like, do they have objections to staying over here? Like, are they like, actually, over here is bad because it doesn't account for something over there? But sometimes that process, that going back and forth, can be the thing that yields, oh, I see now how it's the case both that, I don't know, something. Yeah.
When I used to think that if I am angry, it's either because the person has done something wrong, or I am a person who is bad, who is getting angry at somebody who has done something wrong.
Right, so there was a kind of like, it's like one of these views, and then what did the kind of bridge look like? Like when you found a sense of like, oh, well, it could be either those things, but it could also be something, like what's the deeper, can you describe a bit what that feels like?
We might just value different things, and they did something that they value, and it imitates something that I value, and now I've learned that we value different things. But it doesn't mean that anything that anybody is wrong, just that we are different.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so differences in value. Another sort of abstract kind of general example is like, you can be stuck in a mode where it either feels like you can accept that things are the way they are, or you can want to change them. But it's like, if you want, in order to want to change them, you have to be like, it's bad the way it is. But like, if you accept it, then you're just like, well, I guess it just is the way it is. And there's a kind of like, surely we don't have to just do one of those. And also like maybe there's like a compromise in the middle where we can like kind of accept things and also kind of want to change them, and we're sort of straddling the two, but there's still a tension, like there's still really like, and then there is, in my experience, another mode of being, which is something like an utter radical acceptance that things already are exactly the way they are right now. How could they possibly be any other way? Here they are already. And also, obviously, of course, I want things to be different, and I am inevitably, even if I tried not to, whatever that would mean, I am inevitably going to act in order to change things in the world. And both of those can just be true, and there is a deeper feeling to those both being true at the same time. Another example that I think is quite interesting, how many people here have had an experience sometime in, let's say, the last decade, but I mean any time in your life, have had an experience of having thought that something was kind of woo and bullshit, and then you realize like, oh, there's actually something to this. Is that a thing people have experienced? Yeah, I figured quite a lot of people here, we're evolving into the post-rationality scene or whatever, the meta-rationality scene or something. Or that's my frame on it anyway. I'm aware that some people like to think of it as like, it's all just further developments of rationality. And that's another thing we could try to have a dialectic between, like a kind of, okay, what is the view from which, the true art is rationality, and anything that wanted to be post-rationality should be understood as like what rationality always wanted to be the whole time, versus the perspective that's like, why would it be useful and good to refer to post-rationality or meta-rationality or something beyond rationality as a lens? So, that's another thing that we can kind of bridge. But going back to the thing about woo, I suspect that for those of you who put your hand up, it's not like you gave up your epistemic standards or something, or you kind of, like, I'm guessing for most of you, even if you couldn't totally explain things to like yourself from years ago who thought that was bullshit, I mean, for me, it matters a lot to me that I can explain it at least somewhat. but that there's at least a sense of like continuity with it. Like it's not like you just converted to a new religion and kind of left the old thing behind. I mean, people do that. But I suspect fewer people in this room do that sort of thing, because there's like a desire to have it all be consistent and sort of fit together and kind of map it all out.
Do you think there's a difference when you think of bridging or reconciling different views between things that are like through your own senses or your emotions versus knowledge? So I could think of lots of examples where I kind of felt a mental conflict. I know this thing and these don't seem to be right, but then I found the mechanism that actually makes both of them be consistent in the world. Do you think this is a different mechanism from the examples that we had from, you know, perceiving how someone is perceiving us, or conflicts in our different senses? Is knowledge another form of perception, which will perfectly before in this pattern?
Yeah, in some sense, I'm really not sure. Like, I'm genuinely not sure how all of this relates and comes together. As far as like how I'm currently orienting to all of this, it seems like they're basically the same mechanism, but like applied on different levels, maybe, or something. Like, obviously, you know, like whatever is going on to generate depth perception is like obviously sort of happening in the visual cortex, but it seems to me like whatever process that is, you could also see instances of it happening elsewhere in the brain of like, you know, parts of the brain that are attending to different stuff, and they're like also doing a form of like, like I can now, let's say I can now run this network and that network at the same time when I couldn't before. I mean, I'm just sort of making up some BS neuroscience here to sort of describe what's going on. But the point that I'm making is that it seems to me like there's a very deeply general structure to the nature of wholeness that is part of what's going on here. Like, you can't do the parallax thing if the eyes aren't looking at the same world. And you also can't do it if they're not close enough to each other. Like, if my right eye's vision were suddenly replaced by the vision of like somebody who's in the cafeteria over there, and I'm like trying to synthesize those two views, I'm gonna be freaking out. Like, I'm gonna be like, what is going on? And if their eye also got swapped with my eye, then hopefully we would like find each other. We'd be like, okay, we're both at the thing. Where are you? And we would like crawl until we could make our way to each other. And then we would sit next to each other and just stare at the world like a baby until like it made a bit more sense. And then we would like try moving our heads a little further away from each other and like gradually sort of be like, whoa, here's what the world looks like when it's like extra 3D. Jeez. And then we might like try like sitting back to back and like taking in a whole sphere all at once, right? But like that would be a gradual process. But I think that is something like the natural process by which mind works. Like, mind is that which does that, or something like that. And when I say mind here, I mean, that's what I mean. I could try to operationalize it, but it's like there's a way in which a conversation is a mind. Like, the conversation has mindness to it. It does what minds do, and it does that partially through the medium of the neurons, blah, 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 that are like in each brain, but also partially through the medium of the words and the gestures and the tone and the pauses, and like all of that is thinking in action. Does anybody else have other things that feel like examples of this? Or I can go on to the next slide.
Well, I'm doing this, I think, most of the time when it comes to politics, and usually I think people are talking either about different things, or they might agree on the consequences of something, but they just care about different bits of the consequences. And so, for example, the Polish government has been very polarizing, so I have friends who don't talk to each other anymore because some hate the Polish government a lot, and the others voted for the Polish government. So yeah, and but originally for my personal values I was on the first side. But all my friends who voted for the Polish government, they voted for the Polish government for reasons that I actually respect. Because, well, and I'm, for example, or those who hate the Polish government, they hate the Polish government because they like messed up with the court system, and the people who voted for the Polish government, they voted for the Polish government because they promised to introduce more social welfare or more social Christian values, and the others don't like Christian values. So this allowed me both to talk to the friends who hate the government and those who love the government, which I appreciate. And it also allowed me to understand why people that I really value took decisions that were so different from my initial reaction. And I can't imagine to think or discuss politics anymore without first having a very differentiated look at what are we looking at, like trying to see the whole picture before we talk about the specific differences.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, anybody who is helping do this stuff, this bridging, this parallax in politics, you're doing the Lord's work, keep going, we need a lot of that. So, I'm going to go back to this slide just because this is very relevant to what I'm saying. Which is, one of the things I've been trying to understand is like, how do people end up in worldviews that seem crazy to me? How do I end up in worldviews that seem crazy to other people? It's the same question. And as far as I can tell, it's related to this obviousness thing. So because different things are obvious to different people, if there's something that's very saliently obvious to me, and the only worldview that is acknowledging that obvious fact is batshit insane, I might just go with that worldview, because like, nobody else is sort of offering me an explanation of this thing that's very obvious to me. And so we see this happening in at-large public conversations about things like gender, sort of going back to the earlier question, although I think she's gone. Yeah, it's like, you know, there are some people for whom the unfixedness of gender is very obvious, and so they are going to gravitate towards worldviews that talk about the fluidity and the nebulosity and the changeability of aspects related to gender. There are other people for whom the inherentness of gender is very obvious, and if they're only offered worldviews that either sort of confirm or deny that inherentness as being an element of what is so, then they're going to gravitate towards worldviews that are like, no, gender differences are real, and they're like, and so you get this polarization. And I really see there being a very important role for people who are willing to say things that are sort of obvious to different groups that are kind of at odds with each other, like willing to be able to say, like, definitely there are some inherent differences of something. Totally, obviously. Also, you know, gender structures have been an important part of how we made sense of ourselves in society, and like, oh geez, maybe we should like throw them out super quickly. Also, is it all set in stone and fixed and we totally know what's going on and we definitely know what the attractors should be going forward? No. Is gender weird? Yep. Can people sometimes change pronouns? Totally. I mean, even just like Shakespeare plays, where you have male actors playing women, like they use different pronouns. Like we play different roles, and then the women go and dress up as men and use male pronouns again, and then you get a whole shenanigans. So it's like, there's a way in which like people get they get sort of fixated on certain things that are true, and they're like, I am not going to deny that, and I'm not going to allow myself to step into a worldview where that thing that is salient and obvious to me is denied. And then if there's no other worldview being offered them, then they'll go with one that would, I think, to them under other circumstances maybe also seem kind of objectionable, but because there's something so compelling about this important way that it sees something, it acknowledges the obvious in a way that causes them to feel seen and resonated with, in the sense of like, yes, this, yeah, you get it, right? And you can see similar stuff with the sort of political stuff from the example that we got, and so forth. And this all relates to my next slide, which is great. So, I can tell for myself versus I'll take your word for it. These are two different models of knowing. And there's a real weird question of like, how far can you take the I can tell for myself type of knowing? But it seems to extend into quite a lot of things. Like I can tell for myself that right now I am standing on a stage saying some words into a microphone. I can tell for myself that even if you want to debate various metaphysical claims implied by the previous statement, that I still meant what I meant. Like that there was a mundane meaning to my sentence that I did mean, and that I meant that, not some metaphysically dubious thing. I don't disagree that there's metaphysical questions to everything, but, or like, you know, what do we even mean by I am this right now? I can tell for myself that 1 + 1 = 2. I can tell for myself that the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. That one I initially took somebody else's word for it, then I figured it out once. I guess I have a memory of figuring it out, but I also have sort of a knowledge of like it's sort of true by definition, so I'm pretty confident that if I tried to figure it out again, I couldn't get a different answer. I can tell for myself that you guys are like broadly paying attention to me. Somehow I can tell that, right? Like there's a thing it would feel like to me to be like, no, I'm like in a room talking to people who are like not that engaged. My assessment is that the room is a bit less engaged than earlier, so I'm like, yep, gotta get into the exercises soon. I can tell for myself that the theory of gravity is plausible. Like, that I'm like, oh yeah, when you swing things, they kind of go in a circle, even though they're actually being pulled towards the middle. So I guess that could work for like things being pulled towards large planetary, like I can feel the sense that that makes myself. I don't have to totally take someone's word for it. I can tell for myself that the world is round, not flat. The flat earthers are sometimes like, oh yeah, you're just taking people's word for it. It's like, no, like, I had a video call with someone who was many time zones away, and I saw the sun on her horizon while it was above the air for me, and I really don't know how that would work without different meanings of up depending on where you are. So I'm pretty sure I can tell for myself that the world is round. And yet sometimes we do take each other's word for it, and sometimes we do so even when we can tell for ourselves that something's wrong because of power dynamics. And there is an entire other talk that I considered giving, but is not the talk I decided to give today, that is about specifically this, and about how that all happens, and the dynamics of childhood, and the dynamics of oppression, and the dynamics of what happens when multiple people are in touch with their own sense of I can tell for myself, and they don't seem compatible. That last part is more relevant to this talk. Yeah, communication breakdowns. Anybody here ever experienced a communication breakdown? Anybody ever had it like basically end a relationship? Yeah. I posit here that it's not that the difference of view causes the end of the relationship. It's that it somehow becomes completely intractable to talk about it. And it also is sort of impossible to ignore it. And so there's just a sense of like, well, we can't be real with each other anymore because there's this salient difference that we have no ability to reconcile. I do not have a protocol for how to resolve differences. I do have one practice, which I will share with you in a moment. I don't think there can be a protocol for how to resolve differences. I have a pretty strong sense that the nature of this puzzle is, for lack of a better word, Tao-like. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. Like, that you cannot answer the question of how do we go about resolving differences in the same way that you cannot answer the question of what is relevant. Like, you can for a particular situation, but you can never just pin down, okay, I've solved relevance now. I'll give one sentence for this slide. I do think you can say certain things about how this process necessarily needs to work and how it can't work. And I do think there's a kind of convergent set of assumptions that people can each find if they're all looking for them. But yeah, if somebody wants to ask about that at the end, we can come back to it. So, if I want to see your view, you want to see my view, but before I see your view, I want you to see my view, because I don't want to go first. And I have a solution to this, and we're going to see if we can set up a way to practice that a little bit. We're going to start with step 3 because it's the step that everybody wants to start with because of the you go first problem. Step 3 is you hear me thoroughly to the point where I can tell I've been understood by you. Like, I feel like, yeah, you get me, you understand, you see what's going on here, you see my perspective, yeah. So that's step 3, because everybody, well, it's the first step I talk about because everybody wants to start there, but it's step 3 because you can't start there in practice. If you could, you wouldn't need instructions. So then step 2, it's like, the issue with this is that you can't hear me thoroughly until your perspective feels safe enough that you can listen to me. Basically, like, where whatever defensiveness would be there, basically where you can keep your eye open while also trying to look through my eye, is like one way to put it. It's like, and if you can't do that, then you're not gonna be able to hear me. And so, step 2 is, I hear you thoroughly to the point where we can both tell that you've been understood. And so there, it's like I am keeping my own eye open while trying to sort of take your eye so that I can have this sort of bridged 3D perspective into which I can speak my perspective in step 3. But you may notice that this has the same problem, which is that if I don't feel thoroughly understood, then it might be very hard for me to listen to you. Like, if I don't feel like my perspective is firmly grounded and recognized and like not going to be lost touch with, it might be hard for me to listen to you. So we go back to step 3, and then we go back to step 2. No, this is not going to work very well, right? You get stuck in an infinite regress. And part of the issue is, like, when it comes to agency, sovereignty, like what is truly under my control, I can't guarantee, I can't take the action of getting heard by you. Like, that's not available to me. I can take the action of trying to get heard by you, but if you're not hearing me, then all I can do is kind of go back to step 2 and try to hear you more so that you have more space. I want to be really clear here that this can take some time, and it's also totally fair in relationships and whatever to be like, I don't think this is worth it. It's not like you have to do this. It's just like, if you want to get to the other side, this seems to me like a good way to do it. And so what's the solution to this puzzle?
I tell things without expectation of being understood.
Okay, that's one idea.
I hear myself thoroughly, so that I myself can tell, like, I feel like I understand myself, so that I can.
I talk about like say, oh, it looks like in this situation we're not hearing both of us thoroughly, and I offer you, like, if you want, I offer you to go first and like listen to you until I've completely understood. Like, say the meta level, like, oh, it seems like we don't seem to understand each other.
So kind of like meta-communicate about the
yes,
situation.
And say, I will go first, so if you acknowledge that this is happening and we want to solve the situation.
Cool, yeah, I think that's sort of just saying you're going to do step 2, but it's like, what if you can't actually hear the other person yet because you don't have the space? Oh, there is another really weird option, which is where you compartmentalize away your own knowing and listen to them. You're like, wow, you make so much sense. I was an idiot. Why did I ever doubt you? That precludes doing step 3, because at the point when you finished what you think was step 2, you've actually lost touch with your own experience, and now you're in the other person's cult, or something. Like now you're in a mode where you see their perspective really thoroughly, but you've lost your own, and so now they're ready to listen to you, and you're not ready to talk. And moreover, if you try to get back in touch with what would allow you to be ready to talk, you would then lose touch with their perspective because you've walled them off from each other, and then you'd go to speak, and then they would have objections because you'd be speaking in a way that would not be accounting for their actual perspective. So that is a fake step 2, don't do that. Or do, I mean, you'll learn a lot from it. It won't get you here. Yep.
Yeah, I would say to establish or re-establish the basics that everybody's working towards understanding, like there's a common.
Like, why are we even here?
It's a dialogue?
Yeah, like answering that question, like helping get in touch with that. Yeah.
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 Maybe
in terms of what you said previously, maybe sometimes dropping your own perspective as much possible can be useful to derive the perspective of the other as much as possible, since then you can drop some assumptions that you tend to make that might be incompatible with the other person's assumption in order to derive the association graph of the other person more effectively.
I'm not sure I totally follow that.
I see. Maybe when two people are working on completely different values, then interpreting the other person's with your own values or assumptions.
So kind of like go back and find what the foundational assumptions are.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
dropping perspective as a way to do that, to go back.
Like dropping your own perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there might be sometimes when that can work, there might be people for whom that can work, I'm not sure. For me, it seems that that ends up in the trap of like, now I've heard you, but in a way that's disconnected from what I know, and so then it's, like it can sometimes make a bit more space, maybe.
When it comes to making a space for both perspectives, that there are two potentially different perspectives, and you just need to make a space for it.
And kind of acknowledging that we have two different perspectives, and sort of, yeah, I think there's something really good to that of like kind of, you know, whether you use the eye metaphor or not, I found it can be really powerful, like doing the finger thing with people, and people are like, oh, yeah, that's a different way of thinking about it. But yeah, like you can use that to kind of get people more in a mode of, oh, right, like I'm seeing something, you're seeing something, how do we see deeper truths together, rather than, you know, just trying to sort of hash out right and wrong or whatever else sort of seems to be coming up. Okay, so I have my answer to this. It might be that the, you know, like a lot of the moves that other people suggested are also quite helpful. They are not my specific step one, but they could all make great step zeros, like great ways to sort of approach having this conversation. And Alex hit it. He hasn't seen my slides already. I did send him a long document that was vaguely related to this talk, but maybe he just figured it out. I don't know. So my step one, the step one of my process, again, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but this seems to me to have a kind of power to it. One thing we can notice about step one is that I have full agency here. It's like I have a self-contained system where I have the power to do the hearing, to do the listening, to do the seeing, perspective taking, and also I have the perspective that I'm trying to take. So it's like I've got both of those contained within my me, and that gives me a kind of agency over solving step one that then enables me to have the agency to solve step two, which then enables you to have the agency to do step three. And there is, of course, a puzzle here, which is what does it mean to hear yourself? What does it mean to take your own perspective? So, the principle here is that defensiveness is a sign that we know something, that we are afraid to lose touch with that knowing, as far as I can tell. And I love this quote by Logan Stroll, which I'll read out, which is, when I notice that I feel defensive, I say, I'm afraid of getting sucked into a story where blank. I don't want to get stuck there. And I fill in that blank. When I'm done with that, I say what I want is to retain the ability to see some other blank. And so the act of doing that helps you stay in touch with your own experience and allows you to stop being defensive without actually giving up that which the defensiveness is defending. Because sometimes people will just be like, well, you know, you can't listen when you're defensive, so don't be defensive. And it's like, maybe I'm defending something. That's why I'm defensive. Question?
Could you, by example, fill in the blanks because it's not obvious to me?
Oh, yeah, that is a great prompt. Well, the first one that comes to mind is a pretty general one, but I'll just say it anyway. Sometimes somebody's giving me feedback, and I feel like I'm afraid of getting sucked into a story where I'm a bad person. And what I want is to retain the ability to see that I did reasonable things at reasonable times and somehow a bad thing happened anyway. Like, there was a sense to what I was doing. This is kind of almost like, the thing I just said is almost like an abstraction of this whole structure. I think a lot of them take this form in one way or another. But it could also be like, somebody's trying to explain why you should spend all your time working on AI risk. And you're like, I'm afraid I'll get stuck into a story where I have to spend all of my time working on AI risk. What I want is to retain the ability to see that like literally anything else might possibly be relevant. And you know, there's lots of variations we can give on that one as well. One of the things that happens is that people's defensiveness kind of gets weaponized, because I think we can, it's in general true that somebody who's being defensive is not listening very well. But if you point out to somebody you're being defensive and then try to sort of say, therefore I'm thinking more clearly than you. I mean, people never say it quite like that on the nose, but there is a kind of quality of like, well, you just don't want to accept this uncomfortable truth. As far as I can tell, people are actually pretty down to accept uncomfortable truths as long as they can also accept everything else that they know at the same time. And it's those that are coming in conflict. Now, yeah, some truths, when you feel them, like it feels like getting hit by, you know, like a cement truck or something, just like wham, like ow, it hurts to know this. And so, you know, sometimes people are something like avoiding that feeling. Even there, we can sort of deconstruct it into a thing of they don't feel like they can feel that feeling because that would make them a bad person or whatever. But let's not quite go into that. Did somebody have a question or another example?
Defensiveness in this framework seems something like the internal, about self-narrative, while defensiveness is usually about saving your social capital, saving you from consequences. If a cop knocks on my door and tells me that I am the culprit for a very victimless crime that I have no moral compactions about actually committing, I will still be defensive because I do not wish to go to jail.
Yeah, I mean defensiveness is something like more like you're in a conversation that theoretically is like good faith or something, and you're like having trouble thinking, like you're having trouble listening to information that like in principle you would agree that you would want. Yeah, something more like that. Literally having a shield in front of you to defend against an oncoming army is kind of a different thing.
This is actually also an excellent communication or interpersonal tool. So we think of, it looks very internal, but it's super helpful to recognize that when someone is getting defensive, it's very possible that some part of their identity is being threatened, and it's really acknowledge that. By the way, I think, you know, generally, you're doing great, you're doing the right things, I want to specifically focus on this thing or whatever. So recognizing that this kind of thing, they might not be able to do for themselves, but you can also do this with others, and this can be a great way to diffuse that sort of defensiveness.
Totally. Yeah, it's like basically any time somebody is being defensive, yeah, it's like you kind of go, okay, it seems to them that the conversation has a pressure that's pushing against something that's important to them. So how can we include that as well? That's me sort of trying to reframe what you're saying. It's like if the conversation seems to be pushing against their sense of self-worth, it's like how can we include also like, you're great, that's why I'm still here talking to you about this, or something, right? And again, going back to kind of the meta protocol thing, it might be that if you say you're great, they're actually like, I don't trust you. It seems like you're trying to manipulate me by telling me nice things, right? It's like, well, there is no single answer to what will successfully work, and there never is and never can be, as far as I can tell. What does it mean to take your own perspective? As with everything, the words do not matter, but like you affirm your own perspective, or you validate your own perspective, or you recognize your own perspective. Like you have that sense of seeing, yes, this is actually how things seem to me. I might be missing something, but this is in fact actually how things seem to me right now. I can feel that. I could be confused, but even if I'm confused, then I am in fact having this confusion in particular. And so I'm going to do a very quick, like kind of 1 minute exercise, which is think of a time when you tried to explain something to somebody and they didn't get it. Whether that was a model or a framework or something emotional or something relational thing or whatever. You tried to convey something to somebody, you had something that you meant, and they were like, oh yeah, this thing, and you're like, no, not that thing. That is not what I meant. I meant what I meant. That sensation is the step one sensation. You're looking for that feeling of, no, I meant what I meant, damn it. I didn't mean that thing you're reflecting back to me. And the question of whether you've been understood by the other person, I mean, that's a big complex thing. To some extent, you only need to be understood well enough for whatever situation you're actually in. Like, there might be a situation in which you're like, well, that's not really what I mean, but that'll do. All we have to do is get the thing in the door, and yeah, you understand what I mean well enough. Carry out this little exercise or whatever. But if you're like, you know, married to somebody or, you know, co-founders with somebody and you have some like subtle tangle about something, you might need to get really deep on like, no, what does effectiveness mean when I say it? Like, get really precise on that. Or what does being cared for mean? You might have to like go really deep on that if the relationship is a deeper one. So I thought it would be cool to give people a chance just doing step one for yourself. Like just kind of going through, okay, like, can I really ground my own experience? Now, when you're doing this live, one of the things that you can do is, like, I like to be quite transparent about the fact that I'm doing this. I'm like, hang on, I would like to listen to you, and I'm currently being very defensive because I haven't listened to myself well enough yet. BRB, I gotta listen to myself well enough, then I'll come back and listen to you. People like actually really appreciate that. They're like, you can sort of tell when somebody's like, A, defensive, or B, kind of phoning in listening. You're like, oh yeah, this guy's an idiot. Yeah, that makes sense. You can kind of tell when this is sort of like a surface level, like empathy bot, but like actually it's not penetrating at all, or like, you know, surface level reflective listening bot. There's a thing that I hate. Some people like it, but I hate it. Which is when people do reflective listening by just repeating somebody's words back to them verbatim. And I'm like, look, I don't need you to prove that you're a parrot. Like, that's not relevant to what we're trying to figure out here. Like, I want to know that you get me, that you understand me. I think the reason that people like this is because it is genuinely a step up from people being so stuck in their own view that they literally can't even do that. Like, it's possible to be so stuck in your own view that you can't even repeat somebody's words back to them because you cannot even pay that much attention to what they're saying. And so, by repeating their words back to them, you are in fact demonstrating that you have paid enough attention to their words that you can repeat them back. But I think this is a very low bar. I think we can do way better. That's what this is all about. So, if you would like to take some time and kind of, you know, go explore that, you can. If you want to come talk to me at any point this weekend and work through an example of something like this, which could be like you and somebody else who's here who has some sort of conflict, I'd be happy to help orient to that and help you guys do the either these or just in general what I call trust dancing, which is sorting out matters of shared experience and conflict and so forth. So I will hereby conclude my talk. The point I'm trying to make is that disagreements are better understood as differences of perspective rather than differences of opinion, or sort of propositional differences or whatever. And so instead of seeking the right answer, which of us is right, seek depth of perception. See deeper truths together, or at least try. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, let's do some Q&A. I want to sit on the front of this table. I'm going to do that.
So yeah, co-epistemic statistics. So I saw something which I'm curious to see if you would agree with in the difference between these two and untagged, where it seems to me that has a low or no assumption that the other person knows this, and is open to their own thing, like to me being wrong. Second is both of us should know this already, and both of these are respectful, but doing the untagged one leads to you should already know this, which is aggressive.
Yeah, I have the sense that people are generally stabbing each other in the realities like a lot. Like, there are times when the things we're talking about are sufficiently clear that we don't have to use any of these tags. I mean, if I ask someone for directions, they'll say, yeah, if you go down there, you should see the thing, and then you can go left and turn to the thing. Like, they're not going to say, well, it seems to me that if you go down this road, then probably what the thing you will probably find, if in fact the same thing is there that was when I was there earlier is still there, is a thing, at which point you should turn left. Like, obviously, in general, like, lots of things can go untagged, but there's definitely a thing where whenever we get into heated or challenging conversations, yeah, it becomes increasingly important to be able to really step back. And that, yeah, when we get into those spaces, just simply saying, this is how things are, can have a really aggressive tone to it. Yeah, that's my sense.
And the difference between that and the directions thing is that you are already putting yourself in the student position. Like, you are aware that you don't know and you are welcoming being told
yeah,
how
yeah,
things
yeah.
are. Which,
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. There, and then over there, maybe?
It's an observation as much as a question. So my background is in philosophy, and it reminds me a lot of Hegel's conception of the dialectic, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Loosely, not deeply.
But yeah, so it's often explained in terms of you start with a thesis and then you have an antithesis, so say not that thing, and then those things are transcended in a synthesis, where both parts of them are aufgehoben in the German sense, to retain. That meshes quite well with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the whole talk is very Hegelian, from what I know of Hegel.
And then that got me thinking that this lends itself to quite an interesting sort of extrapolation in a way that what Hegel did was think of this as a model of self-development, so that you can think of yourself as gradually incorporating more and more perspectives in yourself.
Totally.
And also leads to sort of interesting questions about whether there's an end point to this process, which Hegel thought was the absolute spirit that incorporates all possible perspectives, or whether actually it's a sort of open-ended process, as some post-Hegelians thought. So yeah, just some
yeah, I would aim for a synthesis between those two views. I actually had that thought without realizing that it would be funny. I was sort of like, well, yeah, in some sense, the everything already incorporates the everything, but in another sense, it doesn't know how to do it all at once yet. But then also, there is a fundamental open-endedness to the whole process as far as I can tell. And in terms of personal development, one of my most salient experiences of the whole thing was that I had been living for a number of years with a particular paradigm that was based on somebody else's model, and the paradigm was really good, better than anything else I'd seen. And so I used that paradigm for a while, and when I had critiques of it, when I had experiences that didn't seem to fit with it, I would sort of go to that person and try to integrate them in. And sometimes they would integrate in, but sometimes they wouldn't, and they'd get kind of shadowed. And so I had a bunch of knowings that I wasn't able to access because they didn't fit in my based picture paradigm. And then I had a really profound insight a few years ago where I basically realized, it's hard to describe it, but it's something like I internalized the paradigm such that it was now my paradigm, and I was no longer prioritizing keeping it in sync with this other person and how they saw things, which I highly recommend, by the way, even if you're like, yep, as far as I can tell, the best paradigm is, what LWCW on about, or what this cool author's on about, or this, YouTuber or podcaster. It's as far as I can tell, this is the best paradigm. Sure, but you still have your version of it. And anyway, at the point when I had this insight and shift, it was like, I've used this metaphor before, but it feels more vivid here. It felt a bit internally something like the Iron Curtain had come down in my mind. Imagine it being like a bunch of former Soviet physicists and former American physicists or something suddenly could collaborate, whereas previously they sort of couldn't talk to each other. And so it was I'm seeing all this stuff, and I was just having insights constantly for months after that, because it was there was all these missing things that hadn't been able to kind of yeah, so definitely self-development is also made out of this stuff, for sure.
Listeners,
The 3 steps. Yeah.
How well does tabooing, rational tabooing work as step one?
Tabooing? Yeah.
Because I find that people are very pessimistic, more attached to some banners, coordination points, words, rather than ideologies themselves. They will attach themselves to the board, and when they break it down, when you taboo the words, and you just break it down to the exact concept, if you have the time, because it takes a lot of time to use every single time instead of saying capitalism, you mean trading monetary values between people for assets, yada.
Yeah.
How well does that work to break down disagreements and tension?
Yeah, so this is a point I almost included in the talk directly, which is something like, to what extent are we just talking about semantic arguments and whether or not things are being sort of operationalized successfully? And I guess my response to that is a fewfold. One thing is like, the difference that I'm trying to point at, which is not the only thing that matters here, but the difference that I'm trying to point at is not on the level of semantics, or it's rather, it is a shift from orienting to semantics at all. It's a shift from trying to find true propositions and even trying to find sentences we can agree on, which is kind of where you end up with this like, oh, we need to fix the words. And that's totally a thing. I think finding sentences we can agree on, finding stories that we are like happy to both be in, I think that's really important. But I'm trying to point at something about what happens when we shift our idea from like the level of coming to shared words and stories to the level of coming to a shared sense of how things are. And so in service of that, various linguistic tools like rationalist taboo can be really helpful tools. But yeah, it's like we're trying to come to a shared sense of how things are. And one of the weird whole things about all of this is like, it's conceivable to me, I'm not sure about this, but it seems quite plausible to me that there are thoughts that don't fit in one brain, that like you can't have them. Like it's just like you sort of, there are things you can't see with only one eye or whatever, like you need both eyes to see them. It's like, there might be thoughts that we can only think together, and then like when we're on our own, like what we have is the flat projection of the 3D object. It's like we start out looking like this and looking like that, and then pop, we perceive the actual 3D-ness of the cylinder, and then we part ways, and each of us is left with this image, not the actual 3D cylinder, which we can only perceive when we're in deep dialogue together. I've experienced things kind of like that. It's really trippy. Someone mentioned circling earlier. This is definitely the sort of territory that some kinds of circling at least get into. And part of what I want to do is kind of form a bridge between that kind of we space type stuff and what truth-seeking as such looks like. And basically point out like truth-seeking as a still flat project is limited compared to truth-seeking as a depth-seeking process. More questions?
I also wanted to mention that when we like try to infer each other's perspectives, that we like approximate each other's perspectives. That since we have like limited information, limited common ground, limited common background knowledge, and that sometimes like I feel like I see that often. Like for example, in LessWrong Pose, when someone tries to steel man someone else and just is highly confident that they learned all the whole association graph that the other person meant, but it tends to be a straw man instead. So yeah, I feel like that's also important to acknowledge the limitations of this.
Yeah. When I come back to the eye metaphor around that one, it's something like, okay, if I had all the facts that I have about the world and only the vision from my right eye, can I get a sense of what my left eye's view would look like? And the answer is like, yeah, kind of. Right? This part is going to look the same, and then there's going to be a bunch of stuff over there, which is currently an empty void. But like, if I look over there, then I can like look back here and like imagine that kind of snapshot that I just took. Yeah, and I guess what I'll just say is like that is still totally different from opening both eyes and being like, whoa, this in all of its depth, all at once together. I'm not sure how much of a response that was to what you were working with.
Also good. Maybe I also one thing that I had in mind when we were talking about the synthesis of two perspectives. I feel like there are like two types of synthesis.
Interested.
One is like when you attempt to merge the two structures into some other structure as much as possible, and that creates like a third structure. And I feel like what I often also see is like having those two structures as substructures and creating some higher order semantic meaning on top of it on a higher order of complexity. And that way one can climb the complexity ladder, for instance. And even that way see the commonalities between two completely different perspectives that are mostly compatible, but can be maybe shaped enough if one tries hard enough to synthesize them in a way.
Yeah, seems right. I think complexity is super relevant to this, and like relevant to what I meant when I said like maybe there's thoughts that we can only think with multiple minds, something like that. It's like there's like an increased complexity to that that affords that. There's another whole space of things here too, by the way, which is I sort of skipped past these slides because I wanted to wrap, but collective desire, like all of this stuff also applies not just to the question of what is so, like the is question, but also the ought question, which is what do we want. And that gets into some other really trippy territory, and I really love these series of tweets by Rival Voices, where he says, if you're synced, then what you want is what both of you want. Different wants that need explicit negotiation are not the cause of the problem, but a symptom of the problem, which is lack of sync. And no, explicit deliberation is not the only way to get in sync. So that's the same thing, but on the level of shared desire, shared wanting. And like, there's a thing it feels like to sort that out with people, like to just use a really simple example. It's like, oh, where should we go for dinner? Well, how about this place? No, I'm allergic to that. Okay, well, how about that place? Oh yeah, let's go there. Okay, cool. Like, and then you feel like, yes, that's what we want. You can tell that's what you want, that you're not making some weird trade-off that one of you actually secretly hates or whatever. And then that goes to much deeper things, like how do you navigate the questions of like a company or a marriage or something like that. Any other questions? I think it's almost lunchtime. Down here.
So you talked a lot about like personal perspective, and you also encourage us to like take existing frameworks and then make them our own instead of like looking for answers from some authority or something like that. So a dilemma that I frequently have with this is that these frameworks, they have some value, or you want to derive some value from them. For example, that they make predictions about the world, right? And so then the question is like, if I make if for example, if I read one book by Hegel and I think I kind of get it, and then I make it my own framework, but then what I make out of it is actually less valuable than what Hegel himself had, like that's bad, right? So where's the trade-off between like just like following authority in some sense and just saying, no, like I have to follow my own personal framework. That's like the important thing.
Yeah, that's a huge topic. But to get at a bit of, I think, the core of what I said that was confusing there, part of it is recognizing that you only ever always have your own version of the framework. Like, you don't have Hegel's framework. You have Omar's Hegel's framework. And I think there's a lot of value in rereading the book, right? And going back to it and seeing how you can synthesize even more of Hegel or whatever into your framework. But, and this shows up differently when it's like an author versus like a person you can actually go talk to. Like if you've got your main framework from a person who will respond to you, that's where it can get a lot weirder, because then you have these contrary things and you go to try to sync up with them about it because you want to like bridge it to them. And there's something, I mean, part of what makes cultures and religions and so on work is that they do have a shared, at least pretense, that people do have the same paradigm, as opposed to all having slightly different paradigms. This shows up a bit in like the rationality scene. There's certain things that get kind of taken for granted, but I think less so than 10 years ago. I think there's more diversity of thought and more spin-offs and stuff like that. So basically what I would say is the unfortunate truth is that as far as I can tell, you can't ever take what authorities say for granted, because even if they're right, you can't take for granted that you've understood them properly. Like, even if somehow you knew that a person was infallible, you still can't take what they say for granted, because all you have is your sense of what they mean, etc.